Hi, my name's Andrea and my lesson is about the civil rights movement. And kind of my goal in crafting this lesson was to set up the civil rights movement, teach the more traditional aspects of it, and then to go like past 1968 after Martin Luther King is assassinated, talk about some of the other leaders like Malcolm X and Huey Newton. So I thought what I would do is start with Martin Luther King in Chicago and move into Malcolm X and kind of give a little bit of his story. A lot of people don't know that that Martin Luther King actually went to Chicago in 1966. A lot of his work that people know is the work that he did in the South. And the North, although people teach it as though the North is a lot better than the South, there are some things that were happening in the North as well. So Martin Luther King in 1966 brought a lot of people up to the North and started working with people in Chicago. And one of the things he wanted to do was to stop housing discrimination, because that was the thing that a lot of people were having trouble with. And so he gathered a lot of people from his organizations and some of the organizations in Chicago, and they were trying to rally in one of the cities there. And kind of what happened there was he got out of the car and a bunch of people came out of their houses, like husbands, wives, and children came out of their houses and kind of formed a mob. And this is something they weren't used to seeing, because in the South, a lot of the mobs were, 175, but these mobs were like 5,000, 6,000. And the march kind of stopped because someone threw a brick at the back of Martin Luther King's head. And so this is kind of seen as one of his biggest failures, and it isn't really covered, and I think it's pretty important because people need to kind of see Martin Luther King as this human being and see his failures. And from his failures, you can kind of learn why a lot of these other civil rights leaders kind of came to power during this time. So one of the people who was kind of seen as the opposite of Martin Luther King was Malcolm X. And Malcolm X was born in Nebraska in 1925. His father was killed by extremists, and his mother was sent to an insane asylum. So after this happened, he kind of traveled up to the North, lived in New York for a very long time. And because he didn't really have a support system, after a point he kind of fell into a life of crime. He became a drug dealer and a robber. So at some point, he got sent to jail. And while Malcolm X was in jail, he kind of, learns and changes his ways. He memorizes the entire dictionary, and he kind of is in there for about 10 years. And at some point, his brother comes and tells him, I found this new great religion that kind of empowers black people, and it's called the Nation of Islam. So when you're out of here, I'm going to teach you the ways of this new religion. You're going to come out and, you're going to be a better person for it. So after about 10 years, Malcolm X comes out of jail. He's a lot more eloquent, he knows a lot more words, and he's able to give a lot of speeches. And so within like a very short amount of time, he becomes the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. He gives a lot of speeches, and he becomes the public face. And after a point, the media kind of gets a hold of him, and they kind of place him against Martin Luther King, saying that he's a lot more violent. This is the kind of person we don't want to be representing these people. And in 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm X gave this very famous speech where he says, this is the case of the chickens coming to roost. And basically what he was saying was, because we have cultivated this culture of violence and violence and violence, the result of this violence is, our president, our head of state, being assassinated. And of course, after he gives the speech, a lot of people are upset about it. And so the actual head of Nation of Islam kind of suspends him for 90 days. He cannot talk. So Malcolm X at this point kind of becomes disillusioned with the Nation of Islam and leaves. And he goes to Mecca and Africa, and he goes on this very long tour through all these countries. And one of the things he said was, I went to Mecca and I saw people from, blonde hair, blue-eyed Muslims to dark-skinned Muslims, and these people are working together, for peace, and why can't we do that? So after he leaves the Nation of Islam and kind of forms these new ideas, he comes back and he starts to form his organization and actually wants to work with a lot of civil rights leaders regardless of their race. And kind of after this point, the Nation of Islam starts to get a little bit more upset with Malcolm X. So he's only able to preach these new teachings for about a year. And then on February 21st, 1965, he's assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom. So I just think Malcolm X is one of those people that is pretty controversial, but his image was pretty much the same, and his message was the same as as Martin Luther King, but it was just, he went about it a completely different way.